The scream that tore through the Caldwell mansion on that Tuesday afternoon wasn't just any scream, it was the kind that stops a father's heart mid-beat, the kind that echoes in nightmares for years to come, the kind that shatters the illusion that wealth can protect the ones you love. Richard Caldwell would later swear he felt his 4-year-old son's pain before he even saw him crumpled at the bottom of the marble staircase, small arm twisted at an angle that made Richard's stomach lurch. 45 years old, self-made billionaire, master of boardrooms and stock markets, none of it mattered in that moment. Richard sprinted from his study, his $1,000 shoes sliding on polished floors, his mind screaming a prayer to a God he'd stopped believing in when cancer took his wife 3 years ago. Please. Not my son. Not Jamie. Not the only piece of Sarah I have left. Subscribe if you know money can't stop your worst nightmare. Comment where you're watching from. Let us know you're here. The scene that greeted him stole the air from his lungs. Jamie lay motionless on the cold marble, his small body so fragile against the unforgiving stone. His right arm bent wrong, so terribly wrong. The boy's face was white with shock, blue eyes wide and glassy with pain and something else, something that looked like terror. And at the top of the grand staircase, frozen like a porcelain doll, stood Vivian. His fiancée. His second chance at building a family. 34 years old, elegant in her cream silk blouse and tailored pants, her perfectly manicured hand pressed against her throat. Her face had gone pale, but her eyes, Richard would remember this later, when sleep wouldn't come, her eyes flickered with something that wasn't quite shock. Something calculated. Something cold. Richard, she breathed, her voice trembling just the right amount. Oh God, Richard, he fell. I told him not to run near the stairs. I told him so many times, but he wouldn't listen, and I reached for him, but I couldn't. Richard wasn't listening. He was already on his knees beside his son, hands hovering over Jamie's small form, terrified to touch him, terrified not to. Jamie. Jamie, buddy, can you hear me? Dad's here. I'm right here. Jamie's lips moved, but no sound came out. His eyes found his father's face, and Richard saw tears slip down the boy's temples into his blonde hair. Sarah's hair, the color of summer wheat. The boy's gaze shifted past Richard's shoulder, up toward the staircase where Vivian still stood, and something in Jamie's expression made Richard's blood run cold. It was fear. Pure, primal fear. Not the fear of pain, though Richard could see his son was in agony. This was deeper. This was the fear of a prey animal seeing a predator. This was the look of a child who knew something terrible and couldn't speak it. Don't move him, Vivian called down, her heels clicking on the stairs as she descended. We should wait for the ambulance. Moving him could make it worse. She was right, of course. She was always right about practical things. But when she reached out to touch Jamie's forehead, a gesture that should have been maternal, comforting, the boy flinched so violently that a whimper escaped his clenched teeth. Shoo, baby, it's okay, Vivian cooed, pulling her hand back. I know you're scared. The ambulance is coming. But Jamie wasn't looking at her. He was staring at Richard with an intensity that burned, his small chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. His good hand, his left hand, reached for his father's shirt and gripped it with desperate strength. Dad, he whispered, the word barely audible. Just that one syllable. But the weight of it crushed Richard's chest. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes, Richard would remember that too, how every second felt like drowning. The paramedics were efficient, professional, careful as they stabilized Jamie's arm and lifted him onto the stretcher. Richard climbed into the ambulance with his son, never letting go of that small left hand. Through the rear window, he watched Vivian standing in the circular driveway, her arms wrapped around herself, watching them leave. She looked perfect. Concerned. Appropriate. But she didn't look surprised. At County Memorial Hospital, the emergency room became a blur of fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells and too many strangers touching his son. Richard stood pressed against the wall while doctors examined Jamie, his mind replaying the scene over and over. The position of Vivian's body at the top of the stairs. The distance between them. The way Jamie had looked at her. The way his son had flinched from her touch. Dar. Patricia Chen, the orthopedic surgeon on call, was in her 50s with kind eyes and no-nonsense hands. She examined the X-rays with Richard standing at her shoulder, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "Clean fracture of the radius," she said, pointing to the bright white break on the glowing screen. "He'll need a cast for 6 to 8 weeks. Kids heal fast at this age, fortunately." "Fortunately," Richard echoed, the word tasting like ash. Dr. Chen glanced at him, then back at the X-ray. She was quiet for a moment, weighing something. Then she spoke in a lower voice, professional but pointed. "Mr. Caldwell, I need to ask. Your fiancé said he fell down the stairs." "Running," she said. "That's what she told me." "The angle of this break." Dr. Chen traced her finger along the fracture line. "It's consistent with impact, yes. But also with forceful pressure. Direct pressure. As if someone grabbed the arm and..." She demonstrated with her own hands, a gripping, twisting motion that made Richard feel sick. "The bruising pattern on his upper arm supports this. You see these marks?" She pulled up another image showing dark purple finger-shaped bruises. Richard's vision narrowed to those 5 dark ovals on his son's pale skin. Finger marks. Adult-sized finger marks. "Are you saying someone did this to him?" His voice came out strangled. Dr. Chen met his eyes steadily. "I'm saying the evidence is consistent with multiple possibilities. Children's bones break differently than adults. The force required for this kind of fracture, combined with these bruising patterns. I have to ask the questions, Mr. Caldwell. It's my job. Did anyone witness exactly what happened?" "My fiancé. She said she saw him fall." "And your son? What does he say?" Richard realized with horror that he hadn't asked. In the chaos and fear, he'd simply accepted Vivian's explanation. He'd been in a board meeting, 3 floors away, headphones on, while his son. "I need to talk to him," Richard said, already moving toward the treatment room. Jamie was awake but groggy from the pain medication they'd given him before setting the bone. His right arm was now encased in bright blue fiberglass. He'd chosen the color himself, pointing silently at the sample. He looked so small in the hospital bed, surrounded by white sheets and monitoring equipment that beeped softly. Richard pulled a chair close and took his son's good hand. "Hey, buddy. How are you feeling?" "Sleepy," Jamie whispered. His eyes were heavy-lidded but tracked his father's face. "The medicine does that. Your arm is going to be okay. 6 weeks in the cast, and you'll be good as new." Richard tried to smile, but his face felt like concrete. "Jamie, I need to ask you something important. Can you tell me what happened? How did you fall?" Jamie's eyes went wide. The drowsiness vanished, replaced by that terrible awareness Richard had seen on the marble floor. The boy's gaze darted to the door of the treatment room, then back to his father. Jamie's lip trembled. "I was playing." "Where were you playing?" "Near the stairs." I had a cookie." From the kitchen. Each word came slowly, carefully, as if he was walking through a minefield. "I got chocolate on my hands." "Okay. That's okay, buddy. Chocolate washes off." "But I touched her dress." Jamie's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The white one." She was going to her lunch thing. And I got chocolate on it. Richard's heart began to hammer. You touched Vivian's dress by accident. Jamie nodded, tears welling in his eyes. I said sorry. I said sorry right away, Dad, I promise I did. But she got mad. She said, he stopped, biting his lip. What did she say, son? Bad words. Mean words. A tear spilled down Jamie's cheek. About me being clumsy. About Mom. Richard felt something crack in his chest. About Mom? Jamie squeezed his eyes shut. She said I was worthless like Mom. She said Mom died because she was weak and I'm weak too and I ruin everything. The world tilted. Jamie. Richard's voice shook. Did Vivian push you? The boy's whole body went rigid. His eyes flew open, locked on his father's face with desperate intensity. For 10 seconds, 15, he said nothing. The monitors beeped. Someone laughed in the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed. Then Jamie gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. And Richard's world shattered. If this breaks your heart, subscribe, this family needs you to see what happens next. Comment where you're watching from. Let them know they're not alone. The drive home from the hospital 3 hours later was silent. Jamie dozed in his car seat, exhausted from pain and medication. Richard's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. His mind was a storm of rage and guilt and crushing failure. 3 years. 3 years since Sarah died, and he'd been so lost in his own grief that he'd missed his son's suffering. He'd hired nannies who came and went. He'd buried himself in work, building his empire higher and wider, as if success could fill the void. And when Vivian appeared at a charity gala 18 months ago, beautiful, accomplished, interested in him and seemingly fond of Jamie, Richard had grabbed at the chance for normal. But he'd never asked Jamie if he was happy. He'd never noticed the way his son went quiet when Vivian entered a room. He'd been so desperate for the appearance of a family that he'd missed the truth his son was living. The mansion loomed before them, all white columns and perfect landscaping and empty rooms. Richard carried Jamie inside, the boy's head heavy on his shoulder. Vivian appeared in the foyer, still in her silk blouse, though she'd changed into casual pants. How is he? She asked, her voice pitched with just the right level of concern. Fractured radius. He'll heal. Richard didn't stop walking, didn't look at her. He carried Jamie upstairs to his bedroom, the room Sarah had decorated with clouds painted on the ceiling and toy airplanes suspended on invisible strings. He tucked his son into bed, pulled the blankets up to his chin, kissed his forehead. I love you, buddy. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Dad? Jamie's voice was small in the darkness. Is she going to be mad at me? Richard's hands curled into fists. No one is going to hurt you again. I promise you that. I promise. But promises, Richard was learning, were easy to make and hard to keep. Especially when you've been blind for so long. That night, long after Jamie finally fell into fitful sleep, Richard stood in the doorway of his son's room. The cast glowed pale in the moonlight streaming through the window. His son whimpered in his sleep, a sound that drove spikes through Richard's heart. And from down the hall, he heard Vivian's voice on the phone, low and controlled. Yes, the venue deposit is non-refundable, but that's not the issue. We need to discuss the prenup revisions. Especially the custody clauses. The boy needs stability, and Richard is never here. 6 weeks to the wedding. Everything needs to be finalized. Custody clauses. Richard's blood turned to ice. He'd signed papers last week. Vivian had brought them to him during a conference call, smiled, said they were just venue contracts, standard wedding planning documents. He'd signed them without reading, distracted by a market crisis in Tokyo. What had he signed? As his son slept fitfully behind him and his fiancée plotted in her wing of the mansion, Richard Caldwell made a decision. Tomorrow, he would hire someone. Not to clean his house or manage his schedule, but to protect his son. Someone Jamie could trust. Someone who would see what Richard had missed. He didn't know yet that the woman who would answer his call would save them both. He didn't know that the worst was still coming. But standing in that doorway, watching his 4-year-old son sleep with a broken arm and broken trust, Richard finally understood something his billions had never taught him. The most expensive mistake is the one you make with love. And he was about to pay a price that would bring him to his knees. Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study with the door locked, laptop glowing in the darkness, searching for lawyers who specialized in custody cases. Every article he read made his chest tighter. Prenuptial agreements. Parental rights. Emergency custody motions. Words that felt like weapons pointed at his son. At 3 a.m, he pulled up the documents he'd signed last week. The ones Vivian had slid across his desk with that perfect smile while he was on a conference call with Singapore. His eyes scanned the dense legal language, and there, buried in Section 7, Subsection 3, the clause that made his blood freeze, in the event of marriage, Party B, Vivian Morgan, shall assume coparental authority over minor children in the household, with rights to petition for primary custody should Party A be deemed unable to provide adequate care. He'd signed away his son's safety with a careless pen stroke. Dawn broke gray and cold over the mansion. Richard stood at Jamie's bedside, watching his boy sleep with one small hand curled protectively over his casted arm. The innocence in that sleeping face made something break loose in Richard's chest. A grief so vast it had no bottom. "I'm fixing this," he whispered. "I swear to you, I'm fixing this." By 7 o'clock, Richard had drafted a job posting. Not for a housekeeper or nanny. For someone different. Someone who would see what he'd been too blind to notice. He posted it to 3 private domestic staffing agencies with a single requirement, seeking caregiver for 4-year-old boy. Must prioritize child's emotional and physical safety above all else. References from families, not agencies. The responses came within hours. 37 applications. 37 strangers offering to care for the most precious thing in his life. Richard read through them mechanically, credentials, experience, polished letters of recommendation, until one stopped him cold. The letter was handwritten. Short. Direct. "Mr. Caldwell, I don't have fancy certificates. What I have is 3 younger siblings I raised after our mother died when I was 19. I know what it looks like when a child is hurting and scared. I know how to make them feel safe again. If you're looking for someone who will love your son like he's their own, I'm your person. Grace Thompson." Richard called her immediately. She arrived at noon, driving a 15-year-old Honda that looked held together by prayer and determination. Richard watched from his study window as she parked beside Vivian's Mercedes and climbed out. A young African-American woman in simple jeans and a blue sweater, carrying nothing but a worn leather purse. He met her at the front door before the butler could answer. Up close, Grace Thompson was younger than he'd expected, 28, maybe, with intelligent eyes and hands that looked like they'd known hard work. No polish. No performance. Just a quiet dignity that made Richard's designer suit feel ridiculous. "Mr. Caldwell." She extended her hand. Her grip was firm, honest. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Richard stepped aside. "Please, come in." Grace's eyes swept the foyer, the twin staircases, the crystal chandelier, the marble that went on forever, but her expression didn't change. She wasn't impressed. She was assessing. "Where's your son?" she asked simply. "In the library. He's not doing well. The accident was 2 days ago." Accident. Grace's eyes met his, and Richard saw she understood exactly what kind of word that was. A careful word. A word that hid things. "May I see him?" Richard led her through the mansion's endless hallways, past rooms that cost more to furnish than most people earned in years. When they reached the library, he paused with his hand on the door. "He's scared," Richard said quietly. "He won't talk to me about what happened. Won't talk to anyone." Grace nodded. Scared children need time. And they need to know the adults around them can handle the truth. She looked at Richard with something that might have been pity. "Can you?" The question hit like a punch. Before Richard could answer, Grace opened the door. Like and subscribe if you know some truths change everything. Jamie sat wedged between the arm of the leather sofa and a bookshelf, making himself as small as possible. His casted arm rested in his lap, and he'd built a fortress of cushions around himself. When the door opened, his whole body tensed. Grace stopped just inside the room. She didn't rush forward or speak in that high, false voice adults used with frightened children. She simply sat down on the floor, a respectful distance away, and opened her purse. From it, she pulled a square of bright blue paper. Jamie watched, silent and wary, as Grace's hands began to fold. Crease. Turn. Fold again. Her movements were slow, deliberate, mesmerizing. After 2 minutes, she set a perfect origami crane on the carpet between them. Then she pulled out a yellow sheet and started again. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, watching this stranger work magic with paper and patience. 5 minutes passed. 10. Grace folded a frog. A butterfly. A tiny boat. She arranged them in a careful line, and with each creation, Jamie leaned forward just slightly. His fortress of cushions remained, but his eyes followed Grace's hands with growing fascination. Finally, Grace spoke. Her voice was soft, musical. "My mama taught me this. She said when you fold paper, you're folding your worries into something beautiful. Making something good out of something plain." She glanced at Jamie. "You want to try?" Jamie's mouth opened. Closed. He looked past Grace to where Richard stood, seeking permission or protection. Richard couldn't tell which. "It's okay, buddy," Richard managed. "You don't have to if you don't want to." But Jamie's gaze returned to the paper creatures. Slowly, his good hand reached out from behind the cushions. Grace passed him a red sheet without comment, then showed him the first fold. Richard watched his son's small fingers tremble as they tried to crease the paper. Grace's hands hovered nearby, guiding without touching, patient as stone. When Jamie's fold went crooked, she simply smiled and said, "That one's perfect. Now we make the next one." 20 minutes later, Jamie held a lopsided red bird in his palm. It was more crumpled than crane, but when Grace told him it was beautiful, Jamie's face lit up with the first real smile Richard had seen in days. "Can I make another?" Jamie whispered. "You can make a whole flock," Grace said. "But first, I need to ask your daddy if I can be your friend. Would that be okay with you?" Jamie looked at Grace for a long moment, weighing something heavy in his 4-year-old mind. Then he nodded. Richard hired her on the spot. That afternoon, while Grace sat with Jamie teaching him to fold a dog, Richard called his lawyer and started unraveling the web of documents Vivian had spun around his life. And when Vivian returned from her spa appointment to find a stranger in her house, the mask she wore so carefully began to crack. "Who is this?" Vivian stood in the library doorway, her designer bag dangling from one perfectly manicured hand, her voice sharp as cut glass. Richard stepped between her and where Jamie sat with Grace on the floor. "This is Grace Thompson. She's Jamie's new caregiver. We don't need a caregiver. We have staff. Jamie needs someone focused entirely on him. Someone he can trust." Subscribe now. What happens next will shock you. Vivian's eyes flicked to Grace, then to Jamie, who had gone rigid at the sound of her voice. Something cold and calculated moved behind Vivian's expression. "May I speak with you privately, Richard?" In the hallway, with the library door closed, Vivian's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "You can't just hire people without discussing it with me. I'm going to be this boy's mother in 6 weeks. About that," Richard said, his voice steady though his heart hammered. "We need to talk about the wedding." "What about it?" "I want to postpone. Until after Jamie is healed. Until we can." "Postpone?" Vivian's laugh was razor-edged. "The deposits are paid. The invitations are sent. 500 guests, Richard. You can't just postpone. I can do whatever my son needs." Something flickered in Vivian's eyes, fury, barely contained. "Your son is fine. Children fall. They heal. You're being dramatic. He didn't fall." The words hung in the air like smoke. Vivian went very still, her face a careful blank. "Excuse me. I know what happened on those stairs, Vivian. I know what you did." For 3 seconds, maybe 5, Vivian said nothing. Then her expression shifted, rearranged itself into wounded innocence. "Richard, I understand you're upset. It's traumatic when a child is hurt. But you're not thinking clearly. That boy is manipulative. He lies to get attention because he misses his mother and he resents me for trying to fill that role. He's 4 years old. 4-year-olds lie." Vivian stepped closer, her voice softening to honey. "Sweetheart, I love you. I love Jamie, even though he makes it difficult. But if you believe that child's fantasy over my word, over everything we've built together." She let the threat hang unfinished. Richard met her eyes, those beautiful, empty eyes, and wondered how he'd ever thought he loved this woman. "The wedding is off. I want you out of this house by tomorrow." Vivian's face went white, then red. The mask shattered completely. "You're making a mistake. A very expensive mistake." She pulled her phone from her purse, her fingers flying across the screen. "My lawyer will be in touch. We'll see what a judge thinks about your parenting skills. We'll see who Jamie ends up with when I'm done." She turned and walked away, heels clicking like gunshots on the marble. Richard stood alone in the hallway, shaking with adrenaline and something that felt like freedom laced with terror. From inside the library, he heard Jamie's small voice asking Grace a question, and her warm laugh in response. He'd done the right thing. He knew he had. But Vivian's final words echoed in his mind, "We'll see who Jamie ends up with when I'm done." Like and subscribe, this family's fight is just beginning. That night, after Jamie fell asleep with his origami zoo arranged on his nightstand, Richard found Grace in the kitchen making tea. She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression said she understood everything without him having to explain. "Thank you," Richard said. "For today." "For him." Grace nodded slowly. "That boy has been carrying weight too heavy for his little shoulders. But he's strong. Stronger than he knows." She paused, measuring her words. "And he's got a father who's finally looking at what needs seeing. I should have seen it sooner. Maybe. But you're seeing it now. That's what counts." Grace set down her mug. "Mr. Caldwell, I don't know what storm's coming, but I can feel it in the air. Whatever happens, I won't let that child get hurt again. You have my word. Richard believed her. This stranger with her paper birds and gentle hands had done more for his son in one afternoon than he'd managed in 3 years. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm was coming, just as Grace had said. But for the first time since Sarah died, Richard didn't feel alone in facing it. He just didn't know yet how high the cost would climb before the sky finally cleared. 3 days after Grace arrived, an unmarked envelope appeared on Richard's desk. No postmark. No return address. Just his name printed on expensive ivory paper in a font chosen to look official, threatening. Richard found it when he came down for coffee at 6 a.m., Jamie still sleeping upstairs with Grace's origami crane clutched in his small fist. He opened it standing in the hallway, and the words hit him like physical blows. Notice of intent to file for emergency custody. Based on documented evidence of negligent supervision, unsafe household environment, and employment of staff with criminal backgrounds, Ms. Vivian Morgan will petition the court for temporary custody of minor child James Caldwell pending full custody evaluation. Hearing scheduled, Friday, 9 a.m., Family Court, Judge Martha Reynolds presiding. 4 days. She'd given him 4 days before she tried to take his son. Richard's hands shook so badly the paper rattled. All his billions, all his power, all his connections, none of it meant anything in family court. He'd already learned that from his lawyer, who'd warned him yesterday that Vivian's case had teeth. Money couldn't buy back lost time with Jamie. Money couldn't erase the months he'd been blind. Money couldn't prove he was the better parent when he'd failed so spectacularly already. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 6. Upstairs, he heard footsteps. Grace, awake and moving quietly so she wouldn't wake Jamie. Richard climbed the stairs, the letter burning in his hand like evidence of every mistake he'd ever made. He found Grace in the hallway outside Jamie's room, her hand on the doorknob, listening. She turned when she heard him, and her face went still when she saw his expression. What happened? Richard handed her the letter. Watched her read it. Watched the color drain from her brown skin until she looked gray in the early morning light. Criminal background, she whispered. They're talking about me. Grace. I should resign. Her voice was steady, but Richard saw her hands trembling. If I leave, they can't use me against you. They can't. No. The word came out harder than he meant it. You're the only reason Jamie is healing. You're the only person he trusts. If you leave, it proves exactly what Vivian wants. That we're unstable, that we can't provide consistency. But if I stay, I'm ammunition for her lawyers. They stood in the hallway, 2 people who barely knew each other, bound together by a 4-year-old boy who'd suffered too much. From Jamie's room came a small sound, a whimper, the beginning of a nightmare. Grace moved without thinking, opening the door, crossing to the bed. Richard followed and watched her sit beside Jamie, one hand gentle on his shoulder. Shoo, baby. You're safe. Just a dream. Jamie's eyes opened, unfocused and afraid. Then he saw Grace and the tension left his small body. You're here. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Richard saw his son relax, saw him trust those words completely. And he understood that Grace leaving would destroy Jamie more certainly than any court battle. Like and subscribe, some fights you can't walk away from. By 8 a.m., Richard had called his lawyer, his head of security, and a private investigator. By 9, he'd learned exactly how deep Vivian's preparations went. She'd been building her case for weeks, photographs of Jamie's injury, statements from her society friends about Richard's workaholic neglect, even a fake psychological evaluation claiming Jamie showed signs of attachment disorder. And the centerpiece of her strategy, Grace's decade-old conviction, twisted into something sinister. She's going to paint you as desperate, his lawyer, Patricia Chen, no relation to the doctor, said over the phone. A billionaire so incompetent he hired a criminal stranger to raise his traumatized son. It plays into every stereotype about rich absent fathers. Then we show the truth. We show what Vivian did to Jamie. Patricia's silence was heavy. Richard, your son is 4 years old. Getting him to testify is nearly impossible. And even if we could, the trauma of putting him on a stand, having him relive. So we just let her win. No. We fight smart. Grace's journal helps. The hospital records showing the injury pattern helps. But we need more. We need proof that Vivian is unfit, not just that you've made mistakes. After he hung up, Richard sat in his study staring at nothing. Proof. Evidence. Documentation. Everything came down to pieces of paper that might not be enough to keep his son safe. A soft knock on the door. Grace entered, her face grave. Jamie wants to talk to you, she said. He heard us this morning. He knows something's wrong. Richard found his son in the library, sitting in the window seat with his casted arm resting on his lap. The morning sun lit his blonde hair, Sarah's hair, and for a moment Richard couldn't breathe past the grief and fear. Dad? Jamie's voice was small. Is the mean lady coming back? Richard crossed the room and knelt beside the window seat, eye level with his son. She's trying to. But I won't let her hurt you again. I promise. Grace said there's going to be a meeting with a judge. About me. Richard shot Grace a look. She stood in the doorway, her expression apologetic but firm. He asked. I won't lie to him. Jamie's blue eyes, Sarah's eyes, studied his father's face with an intensity that shouldn't belong to someone so young. Dad, I want to tell the judge what she did. I want to tell about the stairs. Jamie, you don't have to. I want to. Jamie's small jaw set with determination. Grace said telling the truth is brave. I want to be brave. Richard felt something break and rebuild in his chest simultaneously. His son, offering to relive his trauma to save their family. 4 years old and already understanding sacrifice. Okay, Richard whispered. Okay, buddy. We'll talk to the lawyer about it. But only if you're really, really sure. Jamie nodded solemnly. Then, quieter, will Grace still be here after the judge meeting? The question landed like a grenade. Richard looked at Grace, saw the fear in her eyes that mirrored his own. Because neither of them knew the answer. Subscribe now, this family's fate hangs by a thread. That afternoon, while Jamie napped, Grace showed Richard the journal she'd been keeping. Page after page of careful observations, dated and detailed. Jamie's nightmares. His reactions to certain sounds. The way he tracked Vivian's movements. The things he'd said when he felt safe enough to speak. This started before you even arrived, Richard said, reading an entry from Grace's second day. He was already terrified. Children don't develop that kind of fear overnight. She'd been hurting him, maybe not always physically, but emotionally, for months. Maybe longer. Richard thought of all the times he'd dismissed Jamie's quiet withdrawal as grief over Sarah. All the times he'd accepted Vivian's explanations that the boy was just difficult or acting out. He'd been so desperate to believe in the fantasy of a normal family that he'd ignored every warning sign. I failed him, he said. You're fighting for him now. That's what matters. Is it enough? Before Grace could answer, Richard's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. He opened it and his blood turned to ice. A photograph. Taken from outside the mansion, through the library window. Clear as day, Grace and Richard sitting together, her journal open between them, their heads bent close in conversation. Below the image, looks cozy. Wonder what the judge will think about the nanny and the billionaire getting so close. See you Friday, Richard. Bring your checkbook, you'll need it for the custody payments. Richard's hands clenched around the phone. She's watching us. She's been watching the house. Grace took the phone, looked at the photo, and something hardened in her expression. She's trying to intimidate us. Make us paranoid. Make us mess up. It's working. Then we don't give her the satisfaction. Grace stood, moving to the window. She stared out at the manicured gardens, the high walls that surrounded the property, the gates that were supposed to keep them safe. Mr. Caldwell, I've spent my whole life fighting people who underestimated me. People who thought I'd break because I came from nothing. But I'm still here. And I'm not leaving that boy to face this alone. Richard joined her at the window. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls, Vivian was watching. Planning. Sharpening her weapons for Friday's hearing. She said she always wins in court, Richard said quietly. Grace's reflection in the window showed a fierce determination that belied her gentle nature. Then it's time someone taught her how to lose. Like and subscribe if you believe in fighting for what's right. That night, after Jamie was asleep and the house had gone quiet, Richard sat in his son's room watching him breathe. The cast on his arm glowed pale in the darkness. The origami animals Grace had made lined his nightstand like tiny guardians. For days until the hearing. For days to find proof that would convince a judge his son belonged with him, not with the woman who'd pushed him down the stairs. Richard thought of Sarah, how she would have fought like a lioness for their boy. How she would never have been blind to danger the way he'd been. And he made her a promise in the darkness, I'll protect him. Whatever it costs. Whatever I have to do. I won't fail him again. From the hallway, Grace's voice drifted through the cracked door. She was on the phone with someone, her tone urgent. Richard caught fragments, need character witnesses, people who saw her with Jamie, anyone who noticed. She was building their defense from scratch, this woman who'd known them less than 2 weeks. This stranger who'd become their last, best hope. Friday loomed like a cliff's edge. And Richard could only pray that when they reached it, they wouldn't fall. The courthouse smelled like old wood polish and broken families. Richard sat on a hard bench outside courtroom 3B, his $1,000 suit feeling like costume armor that wouldn't protect what mattered. Beside him, Grace wore her best dress, navy blue, simple, pressed until every crease was sharp, and held a manila folder containing her journal and character references she'd somehow gathered in less than 4 days. Across the hallway, Vivian held court with her legal team. 3 lawyers in matching charcoal suits, briefcases that probably cost more than Grace's car, and an air of absolute confidence that made Richard's stomach churn. Vivian herself looked like she'd stepped from a magazine, cream blazer, pearl earrings, hair swept into a style that whispered, responsible professional woman. She caught Richard's eye and smiled, small and cold. Jamie sat between Richard and Grace, swinging his legs nervously, his casted arm cradled against his chest. They'd debated for hours whether to bring him. Patricia Chen had been against it, too traumatic, too risky, but Jamie had insisted with a determination that broke Richard's heart. I need to tell, he'd said last night, his small face grave beyond his years. Or she wins. Now, watching his son's feet barely touch the floor, Richard wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake. Caldwell versus Morgan, custody petition, a bailiff called. Judge Reynolds presiding. Grace squeezed Jamie's hand. Richard stood, his legs feeling disconnected from his body. This was it. Everything came down to the next hour. Judge Martha Reynolds was 60-something with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen every lie families told themselves. She looked over her reading glasses as everyone filed in, her expression giving nothing away. "This is an emergency petition for temporary custody," she began, her voice crisp. "Ms. Morgan, your petition claims Mr. Caldwell is an unfit parent due to negligent supervision resulting in injury to the minor child. You're seeking temporary placement while a full custody evaluation is conducted. Is that correct?" Vivian's lead attorney stood, a man named Gerald Whitmore who looked like he ate Fathers for breakfast. "That's correct, Your Honor. We'll demonstrate that Mr. Caldwell's chronic absence and poor judgment in hiring staff has created an unsafe environment for young James. And Mr. Caldwell, you're contesting this?" Patricia Chen rose vigorously, "Your Honor. The real danger to this child comes from Ms. Morgan herself, and we have evidence to prove it. Like and subscribe, the truth is about to come out." Whitmore went first, painting a picture of Richard as a workaholic billionaire too obsessed with his empire to notice his son's suffering. He produced Richard's travel records, business trips to Tokyo, London, Singapore during the past year. He showed Jamie's medical file, highlighting the fractured arm, the emergency room visit, the injury that occurred under Mr. Caldwell's watch. Then came the character assassination of Grace. Whitmore pulled up her conviction record on a screen, making the teenage theft charge sound like evidence of criminal intent rather than desperate survival. Mr. Caldwell hired this woman, a person with a documented history of theft, to care for his vulnerable 4-year-old son. He conducted no background check, no thorough vetting. He simply allowed a stranger with a criminal record unlimited access to a child who had just suffered a serious injury. Richard's hands clenched under the table. Every word was technically true but twisted until the truth became unrecognizable. Judge Reynolds turned to Richard. "Mr. Caldwell, did you conduct a background check before hiring Ms. Thompson?" Richard stood. "Your Honor, I interviewed Grace personally. She disclosed her juvenile record herself, explained the circumstances. She raised 3 siblings after her mother died. She has letters of reference from families. But no formal background check." "No, Your Honor." Whitmore smiled like a shark scenting blood. "Your Honor, this demonstrates the exact recklessness we're concerned about. A parent, especially a wealthy parent who could afford any caregiver in the world, hires someone with a criminal record on a whim. What's next? Who else might he allow into this child's life without proper vetting?" Judge Reynolds made a note. Richard felt the ground shifting under him. Then Vivian took the stand. She was perfect. Concerned, articulate, painting herself as a woman who tried her best to bond with a difficult, traumatized child. She spoke about Jamie's behavioral issues, his withdrawal, his defiance, his accidents that seemed designed for attention. "I love James like he were my own," she said, her voice catching just right. "But Richard is never there. And when I tried to provide structure, discipline, the guidance a child needs, James resented me. The day of the accident, I was simply trying to teach him not to run on the stairs. He pushed past me, lost his balance, fell. It was tragic. But children don't always tell the truth about accidents when they're afraid of consequences." Patricia stood. "Ms. Morgan, you claim James pushed past you and fell. But the hospital report indicates the injury pattern is consistent with forceful pressure, someone grabbing and twisting the arm. How do you explain that?" "I don't have medical training. I only know what I saw, a little boy running recklessly and falling." "Did you grab his arm before he fell?" Vivian's pause was barely noticeable. "I may have reached for him, tried to catch him. Everything happened so fast." "You may have grabbed him hard enough to leave finger-shaped bruises." "I was trying to save him from falling." Patricia let the contradiction hang in the air, but Richard could see it wasn't enough. Vivian's version sounded plausible enough to create doubt. Subscribe now, a 4-year-old boy is about to do the impossible. Then Patricia called Jamie to testify. Judge Reynolds hesitated. He's very young, counselor. He's the only eyewitness to what actually happened, Your Honor. And he's asked to speak. Under these circumstances, I believe the court should hear him. The judge studied Jamie, small, scared, but sitting up straight with a determination that reminded Richard painfully of Sarah. Very well. But we'll do this in chambers, not open court. Just myself, the attorneys, the parents, and a child advocate. Make it as comfortable as possible. They moved to Reynolds' private office. Someone found Jamie a cushion so he could see over the desk. Grace wasn't allowed in, she wasn't family, Whitmore argued, so Jamie sat alone except for the child advocate, a gentle-faced woman named Dr. Barnes. Judge Reynolds' voice softened. Jamie, do you know why you're here? Jamie nodded, his good hand gripping the edge of the desk. Because she says my dad is bad. But he's not. And I need to tell about the stairs. Can you tell me what happened the day you hurt your arm? Jamie took a breath. Richard watched his son gather courage like it was something physical he could put on. I had a cookie. With chocolate. And I touched her dress, Miss Vivian's dress, by accident. I said sorry right away. I did. His voice wavered but held. But she got really mad. She grabbed my arm really hard and said bad words. She said I was clumsy and stupid and she said my mom died because of me. Because I made her tired and sick. Vivian's lawyer started to object, but Judge Reynolds held up a hand. Let him finish. Then she pushed me. She let go of my arm and pushed my chest and I went backward down the stairs. And my arm hurt so bad. But I was more scared of her being more mad. Jamie's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't stop. She told me to say I fell. She said if I told, nobody would believe me and my dad would send me away. The room was silent except for Jamie's shaky breathing. Why are you telling now, Jamie? Judge Reynolds asked gently. Because Grace said telling the truth is brave. And because I don't want to go with her. She's mean. She hurts me. Jamie looked directly at Vivian for the first time, and Richard saw his son's fear but also something stronger, a refusal to be broken. My dad is trying now. He wasn't before, but he is now. And Grace helps me not be scared. I want to stay with them. Judge Reynolds was quiet for a long moment, studying Jamie's face, then Vivian's carefully blank expression. Thank you, Jamie. That was very brave. You can wait with Dr. Barnes outside now. Like and subscribe if you know the truth matters most. After Jamie left, Whitmore tried to spin it, a confused child, traumatic memories mixed with fantasy, the influence of Grace coaching him, but something had shifted in Judge Reynolds' expression. She called a 15-minute recess. In the hallway, Grace held Jamie while Richard paced, unable to sit, unable to breathe properly. Patricia emerged from the courtroom looking cautiously hopeful. He did well. Really well. Kids that age don't typically lie with that kind of detail. But Caldwell. She lowered her voice. Even if we win today, this isn't over. Vivian can still pursue full custody evaluation. This could drag on for months. I don't care how long it takes. Whatever it costs. It's not about money. It's about Jamie. Putting him through months of this. Better than putting him with her. When they reconvened, Judge Reynolds looked tired. I've heard testimony from both sides. I've listened to a very brave 4-year-old tell his truth. Here's what I'm ordering: emergency custody petition is denied. James Caldwell will remain in his father's care. However, she fixed Richard with a hard stare. I'm ordering a full home evaluation and appointing a guardian ad litem to assess the situation. Ms. Morgan, if you wish to pursue full custody, that's your right. But based on what I've heard today, I'm also granting a temporary restraining order. You are to have no contact with James Caldwell until the full evaluation is complete. Court adjourned. The gavel came down like thunder. Richard felt his knees go weak. They'd won. For now, they'd won. But as they left the courtroom, Whitmore caught Richard's arm. My client will be pursuing full custody. And next time, Mr. Caldwell, you won't have surprise testimony from a traumatized child. We'll be ready. Outside, Jamie threw his good arm around Richard's waist. Did I do okay, Dad? You did perfect, buddy. So perfect. But as Grace loaded Jamie into the car and Richard watched them drive away, headed home, still together, still safe, he couldn't shake Whitmore's words. Next time, they'd be ready. And Richard had no idea what weapons they'd bring. The call came at 2 in the morning, 3 weeks after the custody hearing. Richard jerked awake to his phone vibrating on the nightstand, the screen glowing in the darkness like a warning. Unknown number. His heart hammered as he answered, already knowing something was wrong. Mr. Caldwell. A woman's voice, shaking. This is Monica from the security company. We have a breach on the north perimeter. Motion sensors triggered near the guest wing. We've dispatched. Richard was already running, barefoot down the hallway toward Jamie's room. The door stood open. The bed was empty, sheets thrown back, the window raised 6 inches, just enough for a small body to squeeze through. On the nightstand, a piece of paper covered in Jamie's careful 4-year-old printing, I'm sorry. I'm making everyone sad. Going away so you don't fight anymore. Richard's world stopped. Jamie. His voice tore through the mansion. Jamie. Grace appeared from her room, eyes wide with sleep and terror. She saw the empty bed, the note, and her face went white. Oh God. No. Call the police. Richard was already pulling on shoes, grabbing a flashlight. He can't have gone far. He's 4 years old, it's dark. Mr. Caldwell. Grace's voice cut through his panic. Before you go. Listen to me. Where would he feel safe? Richard's mind spun uselessly. The mansion had 10 acres of grounds, woods on 2 sides, the road on another. A 4-year-old alone in the dark could be anywhere. Think, Grace pressed. Jamie talks about places. Places he remembers. Where did he go with his mother? Sarah. Jamie had been barely 2 when she died, but there were photographs, stories Richard had told him. The garden where Sarah grew roses. The pond where they fed ducks. The gazebo, Richard breathed. In the back garden. Sarah used to take him there for picnics. He calls it the safe house. They ran. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke, rain slashing down in sheets that turned the manicured lawns into obstacles. Richard's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, searching. Behind him, Grace's lighter footsteps splashed through puddles. Jamie. Richard's voice was raw. Jamie, please. It's Dad. You're not in trouble. The gazebo appeared through the rain, white lattice work gleaming wet. And there, huddled in a corner with his knees pulled to his chest and his casted arm clutched tight, was Jamie. Soaking wet. Shivering violently. Terrified. Like and subscribe, sometimes saving someone means losing yourself first. Jamie. Richard dropped to his knees on the wet gazebo floor, reaching for his son. "Oh God, buddy. You're okay. You're okay." But Jamie flinched back, pressing himself against the lattice. "Don't be mad. Please don't be mad." "I'm not mad. I was scared. So scared." Richard's voice broke. "Why did you leave?" "Because the guardian lady came yesterday." Jamie's teeth chattered, his small body shaking. "She asked all those questions and looked at my room and talked to you and Grace. And I heard you after. You said it might not be enough. That she might still take me. The home evaluation. The guardian ad litem had spent 4 hours at the mansion yesterday, interviewing everyone, inspecting everything, taking notes that would determine Jamie's future. And Richard had been stupid enough to discuss his fears with Patricia on the phone where Jamie could overhear. "She said I made too much work for you," Jamie whispered. "That you had to hire Grace and get lawyers and go to court. All because of me. So I thought if I went away, you wouldn't have to fight anymore. You could be happy again." Grace made a sound like something breaking. She knelt beside Richard, rain pouring down her face mixing with tears. "Baby, no. You don't make work. You make everything worth fighting for. But everyone's mad all the time. And scared. And it's because she pushed me and I told." Jamie's face crumpled. "Maybe I should have just kept it secret like she said." Richard pulled his son into his arms, holding him tight despite the way Jamie's wet clothes soaked through his shirt. "Listen to me. You telling the truth was the bravest thing anyone has ever done. The fighting isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. You're 4 years old. You're supposed to be playing and laughing and being a kid. Not worrying about grown-up problems. But what if the judge lady says I have to go with her? With Miss Vivian?" The fear in those words gutted Richard. He looked at Grace over Jamie's head, saw his own terror reflected in her eyes. Because that was the question neither of them could answer. What if the evaluation went against them? What if Vivian's lawyers found some technicality, some weakness? "Then we keep fighting," Grace said firmly. "Until there's no fight left. But Jamie, you have to promise me something. Promise you'll never run away again. Because if something happened to you..." Her voice caught. "Baby, you're the whole reason we're fighting. Losing you would break us both." Jamie's small arms wrapped around Richard's neck, his face buried against his father's shoulder. "I promise. I'm sorry. I just wanted to help. You help by being here. By being safe. By being my son." Richard stood, lifting Jamie despite the ache in his back, the exhaustion in his bones. "Let's get you inside. You're freezing." They walked back through the rain, Grace holding the flashlight, Richard carrying his son who was too cold and too scared and too young to bear this weight. The mansion lights blazed through the storm like a beacon, security personnel swarming the grounds, police cruisers pulling up the drive with lights flashing. All of it because a 4-year-old boy thought he was a burden instead of a blessing. Subscribe now, what the morning brings will change everything. By dawn, Jamie was asleep in Richard's bed, wrapped in 3 blankets with a warm compress on his chest. The doctor Richard had called said he'd be fine, no pneumonia this time, just exhausted and chilled. But fine physically wasn't the same as fine emotionally. Richard sat in a chair beside the bed, watching his son breathe, unable to sleep himself. Grace appeared in the doorway with coffee neither of them would drink. "The police found something," she said quietly. "When they were searching the grounds. On the north fence, someone cut the security wire. Recently. Within the last week." Richard's blood went cold. "Someone's been accessing the property. They found footprints. Adult-sized. leading from the fence to a spot behind the guest wing where you can see into several windows, including Jamie's. The surveillance photo from weeks ago flashed through Richard's mind. Vivian, watching them. She'd never stopped watching. She knew exactly where his room was, Richard said. She knew his routines. She's been planning something. Or she's been trying to scare us. Make us paranoid. Make us mess up. Grace set down the coffee, her hands shaking slightly. It's working. Before Richard could respond, his phone buzzed. An email from the Guardian ad litem, Denise Morrison. Subject line, Preliminary Evaluation Report. Richard's hands trembled as he opened it. The email was brief, professional, devastating. Mr. Caldwell, after reviewing the home environment, interviewing relevant parties, and observing interactions between the minor child and both parents, I have significant concerns about the current custody arrangement. While I found no evidence of abuse or neglect in your home, I am concerned about the child's emotional state and the ongoing stress of the custody battle. James appears anxious, withdrawn, and hypervigilant. Last night's incident, where he attempted to run away, demonstrates acute psychological distress. Additionally, I have concerns about the appropriateness of Ms. Thompson's role in the household. While she appears caring, the blurred lines between employee and parental figure create confusion for a child who has already lost his mother. I recommend a temporary placement in neutral care while a full psychological evaluation is conducted for all parties. My formal report will be submitted to the court Friday. We will discuss at the scheduled conference next week. Richard read it 3 times, each word landing like a physical blow. Temporary placement. Neutral care. They wanted to take Jamie away from both him and Vivian, put him with strangers while the courts decided his fate. No. The word came out strangled. They can't. He just tried to run away because he's scared of losing us. Putting him in foster care will destroy him. Grace read over his shoulder, her face ashen. They think I'm the problem. The blurred lines. They think I'm confusing him. You're the only reason he's healing. But I'm also ammunition. Grace's voice was thick with tears. Richard, maybe I should step back. Take a leave of absence. If my presence is hurting your case, you leaving would hurt Jamie more than any court ruling. Like and subscribe if you know some sacrifices cost too much. They sat in silence, watching Jamie sleep, both knowing the same impossible truth. The system designed to protect children was about to break this one. The conference was scheduled for Monday. 4 days away. 4 days to find a solution, to prove that Jamie belonged home, to convince a guardian ad litem who'd already made up her mind that tearing this family apart would cause more harm than keeping it together. As the sun rose over the mansion's grounds, painting the storm-washed gardens gold, Richard made a decision. He couldn't fight this battle with lawyers and paperwork alone. He needed something stronger. He needed the truth, raw and undeniable. He needed proof that Vivian wasn't just negligent or misguided, she was dangerous. And somewhere in her past, in the careful facade she'd built, there had to be cracks. He called his private investigator. Find everything, Richard said. Her previous relationships. Other children she's been around. Any complaints, any incidents, anything that shows a pattern. We have 4 days. I don't care what it costs. When he hung up, Grace was looking at him with something like fear. What if there's nothing to find? Then we lose. Richard looked at his sleeping son, at the boy who tried to save everyone by sacrificing himself. But I won't go down without using every weapon I have. Outside Jamie's window, a single black car drove slowly past the mansion gates. Too slowly. Deliberately slowly. As if someone was watching, waiting, knowing that time was running out for the Caldwell family. And in 4 days, the predator would strike. The investigators' call came Sunday night, 36 hours before the conference that would decide Jamie's fate. Richard answered on the first ring. "Tell me you found something." "I found 3 somethings," Marcus Rodriguez said, his voice grim. "Vivian Morgan isn't her real name. She's Vivian Castellano. Changed it legally 6 years ago after a restraining order was filed against her in Connecticut. By a widower with a 7-year-old son." Richard's hand tightened on the phone. "What happened?" "She was engaged to him for 8 months. The boy started showing signs of psychological trauma, nightmares, anxiety, regression. The father got suspicious, set up a nanny cam. Caught her on video grabbing the kid, shaking him, telling him his dead mother was ashamed of him." Rodriguez paused. "The charges were dropped as part of a settlement with a non-disclosure agreement. But I found the police report. It's sealed, but with the right judge. There's more. 2 other relationships. Both wealthy men. Both with young children. Both ended abruptly with settlements and NDAs. I tracked down one of the mothers, took some convincing, but she'll testify if subpoenaed. Her daughter still has nightmares about the pretty mean lady." Richard closed his eyes, feeling sick. Vivian had done this before. Multiple times. She'd targeted grieving families, insinuated herself into their lives, and terrorized their children. And she'd gotten away with it because money bought silence. "Get everything to my lawyer tonight," Richard said. "We present it tomorrow. Like and subscribe, the truth is about to set them free." Monday morning arrived cold and clear. The conference room at the courthouse felt too small, too airless, filled with too many people whose decisions would shape Jamie's life. Denise Morrison, the Guardian ad litem, sat at the head of the table with her thick report. Vivian's lawyer, Whitmore, shuffled papers confidently. Patricia Chin spread out Marcus's findings like a hand of cards she was about to play. And Richard sat beside Grace, both of them exhausted, terrified, holding on to hope by their fingernails. "Before we begin," Patricia said, "we have new evidence the court needs to see." Whitmore started to object, but Morrison held up a hand. "I'll hear it." Patricia presented everything. The police reports from Connecticut. The sealed restraining order. The testimony from the mother whose daughter Vivian had tormented. Medical records showing a pattern, children in Vivian's care developing anxiety, trauma responses, injuries explained away as accidents. Vivian's face went white, then red. "Those are sealed documents. This is a violation of a woman's right to hide that she's a serial abuser of children." Patricia's voice was steel. "Your Honor, Ms. Morgan has made a career of targeting widowed or divorced fathers with young children. She becomes indispensable, isolates the child, then uses custody threats to extort settlements when the father finally sees what she's doing. James Caldwell is simply her latest victim." Morrison studied the documents, her expression darkening with each page. When she looked up, her eyes locked on Vivian with something like disgust. "Ms. Morgan, did you change your name to avoid these allegations? Those cases were settled. I did nothing wrong. Those were misunderstandings. 3 separate families, 3 separate states, 3 separate accusations of child abuse. All settled with NDAs and money." Morrison's voice was ice. "That's not a misunderstanding. That's a pattern." Whitmore tried to salvage it. "Your Honor, even if these allegations were true, and my client denies them, this doesn't change the fact that Mr. Caldwell hired a caretaker with a criminal record without proper vetting. A juvenile conviction for shoplifting food to feed her siblings." Patricia cut him off. "Versus your client's adult history of systematically abusing vulnerable children. Which sounds more relevant to this custody determination? Morrison closed the file. The sound was final as a gavel. I'm withdrawing my recommendation for temporary placement. Based on this evidence, I'm recommending that Ms. Morgan's custody petition be permanently denied and that a restraining order be made permanent. Furthermore, I'm recommending the court investigate whether criminal charges should be filed for Ms. Morgan's actions against James Caldwell. Vivian stood abruptly, her chair scraping. This is ridiculous. You're going to believe sealed documents over a woman who's lied about her identity, her history, and her intentions? Morrison's voice was flat. Yes. I am. This meeting is concluded. Richard couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. It was over. After months of terror and fighting and nearly losing everything, it was finally over. Vivian stormed from the room, Whitmore trailing helplessly behind. Grace's hand found Richard's under the table, squeezed tight. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Subscribe now. Some endings are really beginnings. 3 months later, Richard stood in the garden watching Jamie play. The cast had come off weeks ago. His arm had healed perfectly, leaving only a thin scar that would fade with time. But the real healing had been deeper, slower, more miraculous. Jamie laughed, really laughed, the kind of belly laugh that children should have, as he chased a butterfly through Grace's newly planted flower garden. She'd moved into the guest house permanently, no longer just an employee but family in every way that mattered. Some evenings, she joined them for dinner. Other times, she gave Richard and Jamie space to rebuild what had been broken. The mansion felt different now. Smaller somehow, despite its size. Richard had sold off 2 of his companies, restructured the others so he could work from home most days. The board had been furious. His accountants had warned of financial loss. But watching his son catch that butterfly and carefully examine its wings before letting it go, Richard understood what true wealth looked like. It wore grass-stained jeans and had chocolate on its face and said, "I love you, Dad," without fear. "Mr. Caldwell." Grace approached with 2 glasses of lemonade. "Thought you might be thirsty." "Thank you." "And Grace?" "It's Richard. After everything, I think we're past formalities." She smiled, that gentle smile that had saved his family. "Richard, then." Jamie ran over, breathing hard, eyes bright with joy. "Dad! Did you see? I caught it and it tickled my hand and then I let it go because Grace said butterflies need to be free. I saw, buddy. That was kind of you." Jamie's face grew serious for a moment, the way it sometimes did when memory touched him. "Grace says sometimes the kindest thing is knowing when to hold on and when to let go." Richard met Grace's eyes over his son's head. She'd been teaching Jamie more than just origami and flower names. She'd been teaching him wisdom that most adults never learned. "She's right," Richard said. "She usually is." As the afternoon sun painted the garden gold and his son returned to chasing butterflies, Richard thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago. Blind. Desperate. Willing to accept any illusion of family rather than face the hard work of building a real one. Money hadn't saved them. Power hadn't protected them. In the end, what had mattered was a 28-year-old woman with a decade-old conviction and a heart big enough to love someone else's broken child back to wholeness. And a 4-year-old boy brave enough to speak truth when silence would have been easier. "Dad?" Jamie called. "Can we make origami birds tonight? I want to make a whole flock for my room. We can make 1,000 birds if you want." Jamie grinned and went back to his butterflies. And Richard understood that this ordinary afternoon in a garden with grass-stained knees and lemonade and the promise of paper birds, this was the miracle. Not the money. Not the mansion. Not the empire he'd built. Just this. Just them. Just knowing that when Jamie went to sleep tonight, he'd sleep without nightmares. And when he woke up tomorrow, the people who loved him would still be there. Sometimes the richest man isn't the one with everything. He's the one who finally knows what's worth keeping.